So I got a call from somebody who wants to think about how to support kids in the context of um, either, urban violence or war. So children's exposure to chronic severe stress and trauma in this case. And I realize that we think so much about there not being enough stress related growth, which is an issue. And that is how we go after even trauma once the trauma has passed. But we think so much about that, um, in part because we have a society that doesn't. But I think it's really important to talk about the other side of things. So I often say there's two ways to get to mental illness. And one is not enough stress, and the other is too much stress. And so one of the things I like to think about is how to create, in the context of ongoing traumatic exposure, no, say not actually having safety, or, well, that's really it, not being safe. And then additionally, like being in situations where maybe some of the very basic needs aren't getting met, because of limited supplies or limited quality food or things like that. So you're talking about a system that's incredibly stressed. And so, what's of benefit? And one of the things I always like to talk to you about is education and how we approach the education. And from my point of view, if there is an opportunity, a building, a place to learn, then I would think some psychological distance from the trauma, an opportunity to focus in on one's studies, is actually beneficial.
Absolutely.
And I would love to hear what your thoughts are about, from an educational point of view, what are the kinds of things you might do with kids educationally? Like some of the things that you mentioned to me, I had like a psychological lens for, but I'd love to hear it just from your lens as an educator, and then I can riff off that.
Raising Moxie will get adults and children resources. Raising Moxie will get adults plugged into ways to frame and communicate and interrelate with youth in these times.
Yeah, that's true.
And it will change adult behaviors, much less kid behaviors, yes, definitely, but it will change adult perspectives as well. But what I'm thinking about in an academic lens for the kids is the voice. Like, we feel so much powerlessness, but when we are able to practice singing or poetry or in my native language, learning that my voice matters and I have a voice and I can express it, record it down in my own handwriting, like gaining those sequential, motoric, kinematic, phonogram style lessons is incredibly empowering when everything else is in chaos. When I can learn to write in my own language and speak up and give voice to my powerlessness or my perceived, all of my perceptions, all that I want to bring to my community and to the world, what's happening.
You're giving me two thoughts.
Okay, go ahead.
So one has to do with power and control, and then the other, like in the learning with my instructor, right? Having a task that in a 30-minute period or a 1 hour period or whatever it is, 20 minutes, whatever, that there is a goal, there's something to do, and I'm able to accomplish it just in and of itself, no matter the child's environment, but particularly in a situation like this. I think that kind of self-efficacy, there is something that I can master here and now, because powerlessness is a big part of what it is to be traumatized. So from that point of view, taking that psychological distance and having that moment to focus in on a task with, and again, you were referencing this already, a nurturing adult who knows how to titrate stress as well. That I think is very powerful. And then the other piece of what you're talking about, especially when you talk about poetry and music and writing, we talk in the old psychological literature, we talk a lot about containment. So there's different ways of being contained. One is through the relationship in that titrating of stress that I talked about, and those communication skill building that we teach. That is one way to titrate stress and to contain. So in other words, the adult essentially creates the containing environment, meaning how they interact with the child or teen helps titrate pace stress in the moment. It's like we're holding the difficulty and we're still holding them to challenges, and we're using communication skills that help them feel heard and seen. Also, in such a powerless situation for young people, a big piece of it is feeling so ineffective, lacking power, and even if you don't really feel heard or seen, right? Because if you were really truly heard and seen, you get your needs met. You know what I mean? So to have that environment where the adult is nurturing, titrating stress is a container in and of itself. And then also things like music and writing and all these different expressions are forms of what Winnicott used to consider like a container. It's another kind of container. A lot of people have talked about this. And it's sort of like when your reality is so overwhelming, to have a way to communicate it that doesn't feel boundless. Because boundless in the context of trauma is not great.
Too much chaos.
So having a way to express something that in and of itself kind of having a container, a medium for expressing something makes it manageable to express. So as you're talking about, then there's the third piece, which is that if I don't get literacy, I can't express it. And also, as I understand from literacy experts like you, by having literacy, I'm actually expanding my ability to think, because literacy gives me language, and we think through images too, but we think through language and grow through language and grow vocabulary to kind of expand. And so, does that sound accurate from a literacy point of view? Am I getting it?
Yeah.
You tell me, because that's your lane there. Okay.
I agree. That's what I'm trying to say, but I also want to say that it's not just enough to give them song and expression. It's also important for them to have their own, in their inner hearts of their child and teen minds, their own self-expression through their own handwriting. Mm-hmm. That's a skill to, in their own native language, to strive for, because it gives them their own voice. Yes, we can go look at the classical poetry and the theater and the chorus and all of other people's voices can be valuable and healing, but having them the ability to gain that skill of continuing to grow in their own writing, that orthographic, phonogram-based, sequential, motoric, kinematic work, that is something they can do with a warm, engaging educator. Mm-hmm. To grow and be able to develop that voice, write it down themselves, and share it out.
So interesting. I once knew a psychiatrist who had a psychoanalytic point of view, and he spoke a lot about journaling and the importance of journaling specifically. And I think that's, in my view, that's one way. I think that, someone might feel like their native voice or is music, or, you know what I mean? Yeah. So like, I do think there's some variability in what can be done. And right. Yet I'm listening to you say this and I'm thinking about that. I know for me, writing especially, it can be like my hands get tired. Being dyslexic, this has been, maybe it's because I'm only partially remediated, but for me, the stress of writing makes it less enjoyable and adds stress. Like, because it's challenging, it adds stress. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting too. What are your thoughts on that?
As a dyslexic and a dysgraphic, I can remember the days when, and I was lucky enough to get um, taught in Orleans Parish Public Schools, where we were exposed to education from like a traditional standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And my teachers taught us baseline origin font in cursive from a young elementary school age.
I think I got that too, but I still...
For me, it connected. It made all the difference in the world for me. Okay. And you can see in the literature that it has a vastly reduced cognitive load, so a vastly increased comprehension when you learn that way from a young age.
Okay, cool.
So I don't know.
So there's benefit. Like, yeah. It sounds like the benefit is very great. It's very great for young kids. And but maybe we're talking about journaling, or maybe we're talking about just learning to write in those early years and giving... We talked about cognitive benefit. So we're also thinking about hope and future for children always. And then the only other last thing I would say is like to do with, how can an adult who knows that there's a young person in their life who's managing ongoing trauma best support them? Some of the things that we sort of said, but I also think like adding the things we talk about in Raising Moxie as well. So like, where are opportunities for exercise? How can that be done? Maybe there's not a safe park, but maybe there's another way. So thinking about the exercise, the sleep quality could be impacted. Obviously, traumatic exposure, you're not going to sleep real heavy if you think that some danger is around the corner. But even in the midst of that, people do survive incredible things and they do get sleep. So trying to figure out how to best support and put things, structure in place, environments in place that can best facilitate sleep. So again, food may or may not be available, healthy food, nutritious food, though if that can be made available, thinking in terms of, inflammation and things like that. Because when you're talking about chronic severe stress, how can we ensure that they get the best nutrients, as you often talk about as well, and how can we take best care of them from a nutrition standpoint? I always reference Chris Palmer's book, Brain Energy, Metabolic Health, all of that. And then those nurturing relationships, both in educational environments if they exist, as well as in any other environments. Is there a place, and this is a really weird question, I feel like in a way, but like, is there a place for adults to get skill building, communication skills to titrate stress in these kinds of environments? Sometimes maybe easier said than done. And are the adults just surviving, and could they engage the cognitive load of, or the stress of taking on new learning, such as through Raising Moxie and developing skills around surf's up method? Like, that's a big question, I think.
There's a point where things shift. Like, I think there are nonprofit organizations that work globally in areas of conflict, and there is a point when things shift and the conflict kind of dissipates, and we're starting to go into recovery.
I think in Ireland, a lot of sort of psychoanalytic folks, people who are psychoanalytic psychologists, like social workers, and various kinds of psychoanalytic folks. I know we're going into Ireland back in maybe like 2003, 4, 5, 6, around that time, maybe longer, and seem to have sort of an ongoing relationship in Ireland. I'm aware of that. With it sounded like it had that kind of flavor to it, like what you're talking about. I do. So I think that's what we'd be looking for, is places that are in that pause or that recovery mode. That would be wonderful to do.
And also not, sitting back and letting things unfold for the kids that are in the middle of it all, as it's unfolding, making those spaces and those community hubs still available during the most acute moments, finding ways. Like, I think there were some Ukrainian people talking about this at one point. Like they go down into the subway or the deep area that's safe from the bombs, and they have school, and they have singing, and they have art and other things. So don't stop that. But once we can, when it's available, we can go in and bring Raising Moxie and uplift all the people, the adults of all ages, the children of all ages, and Raising Moxie lifts all boats.
Thank you. Thanks, Jerome.
Thank you so much.
Okay.